Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Minnesota Reconciling Congregations Winter Learning Event. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Charlie Curtis and Nick Laux as our speakers. Charlie is an educator and anthropologist, currently working as the director of the LGBT Resource Center and director of the Women's Center at St. Cloud State University. So he's wearing a bunch of hats. Neil is an anthropologist and educator who works part-time as the executive director for the Healthy Kane County Foundation. Neek, where is Kane County?
Southern Utah.
In Utah, okay. And fills the rest of their time with a wide array of work and play, ranging from manuscript editing and workshop facilitation to coaching youth sports and guiding hikes in Southern Utah. Charlie and Neek will be offering us a lens which will help us break down the often hard and fast boundaries between trans and cis experiences. They will help us think about trans experiences in a way that will push us to consider how trans and cisgender experiences can be similar, and help us to pay attention to how, despite those similarities, societal conditions can result in disproportionate harm to trans people. They strongly believe that gender liberation is for everyone, and that belief will lead to more effective allyship in our congregational communities. A few rules of the road. First, please mute yourself during the presentation. If you have a question or clarification, feel free to unmute and jump in. But if you have a more extended question, please put it in the chat, and Charlie and Neek will address it at the end. Second, just so you know, this meeting will be recorded and will be posted on the Minnesota Reconciling Congregations website sometime. I'm not sure, in a few, how long does that take, Deb?
Tomorrow's pretty open. I should have it here by the weekend.
Okay, so pretty soon. Finally, I want to give a shout out for the spring social gathering. Yes, spring is coming. Carol Otteson will give us the details for that at the end of our session, so stay tuned. And now I will turn it over to Charlie and Neek.
Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm Charlie. My pronouns are they, them. And then Neek.
I'm Neek. My pronouns are also they, them. Not really creative around here.
So we're really excited to have you all here. We do have a lot we're trying to cover tonight. So we're going to dive right into things. But we want to just sort of flag one thing first. And that is that the approach we're taking tonight is a little bit unconventional, perhaps, when it comes to allyship training. It might feel a little different than allyship trainings that you have attended in the past if you've been to previous ones, both in the content and the framework that we're presenting.
Yeah. And so our hope is that you'll be positively challenged by this framework. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it. So today, we want you to focus less on like taking in and memorizing specific information about trans people and more about shifting your frame of thinking about trans people and your community. So to kick things off, we just want to start with a kind of the sort of theological centering or inspiration for our framework. And as mentioned in our event description, our approach is inspired by a particular understanding of Jesus's ministry. Specifically that he wasn't speaking from the center, encouraging those in the center to take pity on those in the margins, but that he was speaking from the margins and really calling for a dissolution of the barriers and hierarchies that set up that center and margin. So what does that mean for LGBTQ allyship? Too often, education about I'm going to say queer experiences as just an umbrella term. Too often, education about queer experiences and issues for straight and cisgender allies implicitly reinforce a notion of difference between queer and trans experiences and cisgender and heterosexual experiences. And the result is that allyship can start to feel more of an act of charity than an act of mutual aid. And this frame risks reproducing those sharp distinctions between the center and the margins while othering LGBTQ plus folks. So consequently, cisgender and heterosexual people often come out of allyship trainings thinking of queer and trans experiences as fundamentally different from their own.
So what are the impacts of this, of thinking of these experiences as so fundamentally different from one another? One really common experience that comes out of this is cisgender and heterosexual folks getting stressed out and at times defensive because they're experiencing learning about queer and trans experiences and learning about how to be an ally as somehow a test. And that really shapes how you're thinking about like the data or the information that you're learning about queer and trans experiences. And it can also make it harder to remember because it can feel more distant.
I'm going to see.
It also makes it harder for trans people to feel like we're truly a part of a community, to feel like just one of many people in the community, rather than being sort of tokenized and set apart. And I'll just flag here that this in particular has really big implications for specifically church community building. And in general, this isn't about negative intentions or microaggressions, although it can be about those things at times. But it's more a sense of distance that's being fed by things like this previous point about being stressed about messing up, being stressed about failing the test. And thinking about trans and cis experiences as fundamentally different from one another makes it harder for people to see the shared interests and the shared struggle that trans and cis people actually do have across a lot of different domains of life, ranging from healthcare, administrative things, life in general.
Relatedly, thinking of trans and cis experiences as fundamentally different from each other perpetuates the notion that trans people alone have gender and that trans people alone are unique in their efforts to seek gender affirming care. And this obscures the reality that cis folks have just as much gender and also seek gender affirming care. So all of what we sort of talked about in terms of the impacts of thinking of these things as fundamentally different leads us to want to encourage you to move toward understanding that trans people are not, in fact, unique in this regard. And there's an important implication in this shift of frame, which is that gender liberation is not the exclusive territory of magical trans people, but gender liberation is for everybody. And when we recognize this, the shared interests and issues and struggles that we have across cisgender and trans folks can become more visible, and cis-trans relationships can involve more genuine empathy and less othering.
So one topic that was specifically requested, and when we were talking about this presentation and kind of what the content would focus on, was the experience of gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is distress that's experienced as a result of a misalignment between one's internal sense of self and one's assigned gender and or body. And at first glance, this seems like an exclusively trans experience and sort of a definingly trans experience. You might be familiar with dominant narratives about trans people and the idea of being born in the wrong body. We actually believe that the best path for cisgender people to understand gender dysphoria in a way that fosters connection rather than othering is to let go of the notion that this experience is entirely foreign to them and to other cis people. So we're going to share some examples next that are going to illustrate this argument that trans and cis experiences of gender, gender dysphoria and gender affirmation actually exist along the same spectrum.
Yeah. So the first story that we're going to share is that I had top surgery, which for me was a double mastectomy in 2020. And I was, of course, quite nervous about this. I was living in small town southern Utah, not exactly known for being yay trans, but I ended up being in a lot of pain after my surgery, and I ended up going to PT, which of course was a little bit daunting because the setting that I was in. And in my experience, the PT aide that I was working with, they had, learned about my procedure, and then they had sort of been like, oh, why did you have a double mastectomy? And often, of course, people think cancer, things like that. And I wasn't really sure what to say, but I just said, hey, it helped me feel better in my body. And that was about as much detail I was going to go into. And this PT aide was like, I completely know what you mean. And it turns out that she had just recently come off of medical leave because she had had a breast reduction. And she specifically said, yeah, my body just didn't feel like me. Interestingly, in the same period, in these sort of months of recovering after my surgery, I also had a friend, and we were talking about my experience, and she's like, oh yeah, I totally get it. And she had had a breast enhancement some years ago because she just had felt not quite right in her body. And so this was a really interesting experience for me. I think it was a learning experience for me to really start to understand that this notion of some kind of embodied sense of alignment or rightness is really not solely the domain of trans people, and that there are all kinds of folks who have a way of embodiment that is most comfortable for them. Similarly, I was talking with a friend a few years ago about hormones, and she was like, oh yeah, I feel really, really awful if I am not taking supplemental hormones. And obviously these kinds of things can blur a little bit with different medical conditions. But it was this really powerful point of connection of cisgender people being able to understand from their own experience this I think it is often feels a little bit intangible, but this notion of something being not quite right in terms of your embodiment of gender, but there being a pathway towards feeling more comfortable, more at home in your own skin. So that's kind of like some examples from the domain of gender dysphoria. Another example that we wanted to point out as a kind of like experience shared across trans and cis folks is that I'm currently living in small town Utah, and I often have some conversations with the parents of boys in this town who are the free spirit boys. Some of them like pink, some of them want to paint their nails, some of them want to dance. And the parents that I talk to are actually open to their kids having their own kind of expression. But then when their kids hit school age, they're kind of faced with this tough choice. They can continue the expression that feels good to them and that they like, and that is enjoyable for them, and likely experience this social ostracization because it's not aligned with normative gender expectations. Or they can shift their expression, right? They can align with normative masculinity. And I think one of the things that is important to point out about this is that, say one of those free spirit boys makes the choice to align with normative masculinity, they may in fact be cisgender boys that just happen to like to paint their nails or happen to like pink or any other thing that's associated with other genders. But when they choose to align with normative masculinity, that's not without cost to them, because there is a kind of pain in abandoning what feels like authentic expression. And this is the same choice that trans people face regarding whether or not to take action toward an outward expression of their authentic sense of self. So some trans folks choose not to transition, or they delay their transition because of these concerns around social ostracization, bullying, stigma. And that really is a parallel to any number of people who may be cisgender or transgender or anywhere in between. Let's not risk reinforcing that binary too much. But it's when we conform to normative gender expectations, regardless cis, trans, or otherwise. Of course, there are times when our authentic experience might align with normative masculine or feminine characteristics, but when we are having to abandon something that feels authentic to us, and aligning with normative masculinity or normative femininity when it doesn't feel affirming, there is a kind of pain to abandoning what is your sort of like most authentic self.
So we wanted to take a little moment here to have you all think about this a little bit and brainstorm some examples of actions that cis people take to feel good in their bodies and or aligned with their sense of self. So you can drop thoughts in the chat. I know there are some folks who are viewing in groups. You can discuss in your groups. Please mute though, if you're discussing in a group so that it's not overwhelming for everyone. And if you have some thoughts that you want to share verbally, we can take a few of those as well. So just raise your hand if you'd like to do that.
So the prompt is brainstorming examples of actions cis people take to feel good in their bodies or to feel aligned with their sense of self.
And we'll give you a few minutes.
I really like the comment from Kate. I'm going to let people brainstorm a little. I love Caitlin's comment, but I'm going to let people brainstorm for a couple minutes and then we can start talking about them. We'll take like one more minute. Nice. So people are definitely welcome to drop more thoughts in the chat. But we're going to start talking about some of these comments. I'm just going to go through the ones in the chat first. And then if anybody from the FUMC crowd wants to add anything from their discussions, let us know. So one of the things that I really like about Caitlin's comment that was talking about how many people exercise to feel good in their body. And then when Caitlin exercises, you don't feel good. You don't feel aligned with yourself. And I definitely feel that very deeply. And I think what I really like about that comment is that it reminds us of kind of the blurry boundary between what is gender affirmation and what is just generally self-affirmation. And I think the reality is like, that's actually really, really, it's not a fine boundary. And that certain things are seen as gendered behaviors because of various, social and cultural norms. But it's a kind of a running joke among non-binary folks that your gender is like fill in the blank with something that actually has very little to do with gender.
Yes.
Like my gender is dinosaurs, and you might like other non-binary people get it, but so anyway, but I do think it's a good point, right? That it's actually quite blurry. Where does sort of gender expression and other expression end and begin. And I think the reality that that's not even binary is a important point. Dick and Kathy added clothing. Yep. So a lot of clothing styles are gendered culturally speaking, and certain kinds of clothing might feel good for us. Also, most 4-year-olds love dresses regardless of their gender because they're swirly and spinny. So like things can be affirming outside of gender bounds. Getting perms so that your hair can look how you want it to look. That's a really great example. Long hair, short hair, wild color, different lengths of hair. Going to a doctor who makes someone feel comfortable for asking, I'm assuming, gender related questions, intimate related questions. Yeah, so I think that's another good reminder that gender is relational. And I actually, I've experienced that a lot lately, where I use they, them pronouns. If people aren't going to use they, them, I'd prefer people use he, him instead of she, her. But then I'm like, oh, wow, people treat you differently when they read you as a man. And that's different. So
I concur. I have had a lot of pronouns in a lot of phases of my life, and people treat you differently at different times, depending on your pronouns.
Think Marty's comment really makes me think of like, oh, gender is also relational, and there's certain types of relating to other people that are going to feel good to me, and that might be different than something that feels good to another person. And again, that's not because I'm trans, it's because each of us has something that feels good for us. Great. Should we move on?
Were there any folks who wanted to say anything verbally? You could raise your hand.
Any verbal folks? Okay. You can add stuff later if you really want
Just
to.
Just a second.
Q&A time.
Anyone here who'd like to add to the conversation? There are 10 of us here, so.
Well, we hope that you at least talk to each other.
Yeah,
we did.
Good. So the examples we've talked about so far are largely focused on the ways that embodied experiences of trans and cis people are not fundamentally different. But we also find a similar pattern when we're looking at experiences moving through the political and legal systems of our contemporary world.
Yeah. I'd say political, legal, and bureaucratic systems, of which there are many, right? So I actually quite recently, this past year, had a conversation actually with someone at work. It was in my job capacity. Someone came in, and this was a woman in her early 40s. And I'm not going to name her role on campus because I don't want to risk any identifying of her. But she came in to talk to me in my capacity at my job because she was afraid that she was pregnant and she needed a pregnancy test and she couldn't afford it. And we give out pregnancy tests. So she came to ask if she could have one. And this was obviously a stressful situation for her. And so we were talking, and she shared with me that she had earlier in her life, I don't know when exactly this was, but she had tried to get a hysterectomy. Because for multiple reasons, but in part because she desperately did not want to have the fear of being pregnant when she didn't need to be. She also happened to have a medical condition for which a hysterectomy is not an unreasonable course of treatment. And this was denied by the insurance company that she had. And the pain that she was in about having begged to have a hysterectomy and have this particular type of care for her body, and that being denied for reasons that had nothing to do with whether or not it was safe for her to have one, whether or not it was the right choice for her, whether or not there was capacity to deliver that care in the location where she was, but entirely to do with what the rules were or what the determinations were from other people about whether or not she really needed it. So the response from the insurance company was basically, well, there's other things you could do to treat this medical condition that you have. There's other ways you can avoid being pregnant when you don't want to be. And she was saying, but this is the approach that is right for me in my life. not just in this abstract sense of what are the possible ways that I could address these two concerns, but for me in my life to be able to live my life the way that I want to live my life and be in my body in the way that I want to be in my body. This is the right choice for me. And it's not an unreasonable choice given these circumstances of the medical condition and her goals around avoiding pregnancy. This is really similar to the situation that trans people face when we're navigating trying to get gender affirming care. That there can be a lot of barriers. There can be a lot of questioning whether or not you really need it. There can be a lot of hoops to jump through in order to get it that are above and beyond the normal, what we would think of as the normal, like I have to like go to and get a referral to see a specialist, additional hoops beyond that lead to not being able to access medical care that you desperately need. And that is absolutely 100% the right choice for you and for your life and for you in your body. So there's all these issues around bodily autonomy, around access to affordable healthcare, and the bureaucracy of our systems that people are having to navigate, that you can access this care if you have the money and you have the knowledge and the wherewithal to go out and get it and pay out of pocket. Perhaps you can get it. That's the position a lot of trans people are in, and that's also the position a lot of cis folks are in for medical care. And for all kinds of other issues, but just to highlight the medical care issue. We also see a lot of sort of similarity in sort of navigating bureaucratic systems when it comes to things like name changes, right? So a lot of trans people will change our names and do that as a legal name change process. A lot of cisgender people also change their names for a lot of reasons, right? There are people who change their name because they get married. There are people who change their name because they get divorced. There are people who change their name because they just like a different name. There are people who change their name because they want to have their mother's last name instead of their father's last name, whatever it may be. And for anyone who on the call who has changed your name before, you will know that it is a pain. For trans people or anyone going through a legal name change process that is sort of not tied in with marriage or divorce, there can be additional steps up front in terms of the process of going through the court system and getting that approved and paying for it. And depending on where you are, there can be quite a lot of requirements to be able to do that. But even if you do it through like getting married, in which it's a somewhat more streamlined process, it still is not entirely easy. And the after is the really hard part, right? The updating your name everywhere. And the years later, you're still finding places where you thought you had updated it and you haven't, or you're still getting junk mail that is coming to your previous name. And when we think about cis people changing their names, like often the number one thing that we think about is cisgender women getting married and changing their name. And so I think we often don't think of that as like seeing the previous name as a negative thing, that people are sort of like, well, that's your maiden name, and then you have your married name. And if you get some junk mail in your previous name, it's not the end of the world. And maybe that's the case for a lot of folks, but there are also a lot of cisgender people for whom seeing their previous name is painful. I have a very dear friend actually who had graduated from her degree program before her divorce was finalized and before her name change from her divorce was finalized. And she desperately did not want her married name to be on her diploma. And so she went through the process, she got her name changed, she got her last name to be the name she wanted it to be, and she got her diploma reissued so that it would be the correct name. And down at the bottom, it said originally issued to, and it had her married name on it. And so that caused her a lot of pain. It caused her pain in the same kind of way that if I had my diploma and it said at the bottom, previously issued to, and then it had my previous name on it, I would feel pain about that. And a lot of trans people feel a lot of pain when we encounter our previous names, or a lot of folks will call it their dead name. There are cis people who experience that same kind of pain when they see a previous name and when it comes up again and again, despite doing all of the things that they're supposed to do to try to update their name in all of the places. And you've tried and you've talked to 16 different customer service people, and so they still can't get it all fixed correctly. The problem is our bureaucracy here, not something unique to like trans people changing our names. And I don't know the answer to fixing the bureaucracy on name stuff, but just to say that the experience of the difficulty of it is actually quite shared.
Great. Yeah, so across we've shared some stories about gender dysphoria and embodied experiences of gender, about outward gender expression, the things that help us feel comfortable and how we're presenting ourselves to the world. Charlie covered the questions of bodily autonomy and accessing healthcare, and also the mind-numbing experience of name change bureaucracy, but most importantly, the reality that like this relationship that you might have to a previous name and then navigating this experience, that kind of pain is also shared. You can see that throughout all of these stories, we're talking about experiences that are often narrated as being kind of a uniquely trans experience, that we see all of these similarities, experiences that we share with cis people as well. And we wanted to share these things to really help you see that all people have a stake in this, and that really gender liberation is for everybody. And as we all know, just from our observations in the world, while we have these similar experiences, trans and cis people moving through those experiences, how they address gender dysphoria, how they move through these political legal systems, bureaucracy, they're not treated in the same way. And so it is important to name that having these shared experiences doesn't mean that the outcome is necessarily the same. But when we look at marginalization, discrimination of trans folks, it's important to point out that it's the societal attitudes towards transness that are marking trans choices as different from cis choices, that are marking trans choices as extreme and leaving cis choices that are actually quite similar, leaving those unmarked. And this is what produces such different lived experiences for trans people in terms of when we look at various discrepancies in like employment, health, well-being, all of these things. We argue that is coming out of the ways that trans experiences are labeled and not being treated the same, more so than them being fundamentally different experiences. And I think that one really concrete example of that is the medical gender affirming care. So medical gender affirming care for cisgender people typically goes unlabeled, to the point that many people don't even realize that the kinds of procedures that cisgender people are going through is gender affirming care. It doesn't become the center of a moral panic. But then for trans people, it's pathologized. Like literally, we had to get DSM diagnoses to get insurance to help cover gender affirming care, which was much needed care. So it's both a sort of cultural and like structural pathologization of gender affirming care that is not fundamentally different from the types of care that cisgender people also pursue.
So what can you do? With all of what we've talked about so far in mind, we really firmly believe that breaking down the distinction between center and margin is a critically important part of the work needed to take action against the oppression of trans people. And that oppression occurs whenever trans experiences are othered and treated as different. Even when you're trying to be supportive, if you are viewing it as over here are cis experiences and over there are trans experiences, you're already working in a framework that is at best amenable to hierarchy, and at worst is actively enacting and reproducing hierarchy. What can you do to normalize and destigmatize trans experiences to work towards deconstructing that hierarchy? Importantly here, beyond taking this action, and we'll get to some actions, beyond taking action because you might feel that it's a morally right thing to do, or you might feel that it aligns with your personal or community values, actions that normalize and destigmatize trans experience also contributes to the work of helping trans people feel like we are truly a part of your congregation. Welcomed, of course, yes, but also not tokenized. And this is work that helps trans people be just another member of the community in a positive way.
Cool. So the first one, did you want to pop up those slides, Charlie? We're gonna kind of describe each of these in detail, but to help you organize your thoughts as you take this in, we wanted to put up our sort of key statements as we move through them.
There we go.
Great, thanks. So the first point within this question of what can you do is to normalize the steps that people take to feel at home in their bodies. So that looks like not treating the steps that trans people take to feel right and good in their bodies, treating that as not weird or foreign. So not participating in that pathologizing of trans experience, and to really try to avoid reproducing narratives that are amplifying the othering of trans experience. So obviously there's especially bad othering. We certainly see enough of it in the news these days. But I think it's important to remember that there can also be sort of well-intentioned, you're not seeking to do harm, but it can still kind of be othering to trans people. And so that looks like, remembering these similarities in terms of the steps that people take of cis trans all around that people take to feel at home in their bodies. So to stop seeing transition care as this kind of other foreign thing, and to instead see that the things that trans people choose for their lives are just things that people choose for their lives, and that we all choose things for our lives to feel right in our bodies. And this helps break down that stigma for any person who takes steps to feel at home in their body.
Next, we would say to be an advocate for liberated gender expression. Strive not to require trans people to be passing, if folks are familiar with that term, in order for you to be able to gender them correctly. And this is part of that gender liberation is for everyone. We want all people, including cis people, to express themselves how they want to. And we shouldn't force trans people to conform to normative feminine or masculine gender expression in order to be gendered correctly by the people they know. And this is both from the standpoint of physical features that trans people might have dysphoria about, but can't change, can't control. And also from the standpoint of not forcing trans women to be extremely feminine and trans men to be like super macho in their expression. And this will will definitely involve unlearning normative ideas of gender expression, and it will also require putting in the mental effort to switch off of the cultural autopilot that most of us develop around interpreting masculine and feminine characteristics. Gender liberation for everyone means that cisgender people with non-normative gender expression, so masculine women, feminine men, people of either gender, of those genders who are doing other stuff outside of feminine and masculine binary, get to be exactly who they are. We can't know someone's gender based on what they look like. We can't know their gender identity based on what someone looks like. And we do sometimes see folks who are trying so hard to be affirming that they kind of end up swinging this like too far the other way, where they are assuming that someone who looks a little bit non-normative must be trans. So they're making an assumption about what is someone's sex assigned at birth, and then making an assessment of their gender expression and seeing that those two seem misaligned or not how one would expect them to go if they were going to be a cisgender person, and then they assume that it's a trans person, and that's not always the case. So this is where the pronoun practices that you might have learned in other kinds of trainings you might be aware of. This is kind of where they come in and are actually really important to do consistently throughout your life, and not only when you're encountering someone who you think like looks trans. So asking other people's pronouns, sharing your pronouns when you introduce yourself, and again, doing that with lots of people, ideally throughout your life, not just when you're encountering someone who you think looks like they might be trans. And to not make assumptions in general. And sharing pronouns also, like these practices also normalize a type of interaction and a type of practice that helps trans folks be able to communicate information that will then help you affirm the trans folks that you're encountering.
And it really, like, I can't overstate. Anyway, really want to emphasize that it makes a huge difference when people who are cisgender or cispassing take the step to share their pronouns first. It just, occasionally I have meetings for work, and then some of my friends are in these meetings and they're like, oh, we were a little surprised you didn't share your pronouns. And like some days I'm just like, I just don't want to be the only one. I just don't want to be the only person who's marked as this other thing that like, oh, I'm someone with pronouns, so I have to educate people about my pronouns. Like some days I'm just like, if one other person had shared their pronouns, I would have then felt good about like, great, now I feel like I can educate these people to help them be able to see me how I want to be seen. But it really, really does make a difference when there are other people in the room who take that step, especially because for people whose pronouns that feel good to them are the ones that people assume all the time, the stakes of them sharing their pronouns are a lot lower than the stakes of me sharing my pronouns. So it makes a big difference. Okay, the next one is to know people as individuals. So there's a couple things wrapped up in this concept. One is you need to want to know and care about trans individuals as individuals, right? Like it's one thing to learn about trans people and trans experiences in a more general way. But like if you have a trans neighbor, if you have a trans member of your congregation, you got to want to get to know them and care about them. And we also pair this with a great, we're calling it a great mental hack, kind of jokingly, but it's to understand gender differences in a similar way that you understand other individual differences. So you got to take it out of the abstract. We're not just thinking about trans people in general, but you got to want to be around trans people and have trans people in your community. And I think that this ties back into a Christian ethic of like, of course, you can't know everyone in the world in a literal sense, but you do need to want to know people as individuals in order to love and care for them as your neighbor. And This is also important in part because each trans person is a different individual, which again, this theme of talking about things that are not unique to trans people, all of us are different individuals, right? And just like not all cis people experience gender in the same way, not all trans people experience gender in the same way. And like, this experientially, so think of, just real quick in your head, you can kind of think of who's another person who's the same gender as you, if you're a man or a woman or non-binary or something else. And do you experience gender in exactly the same way? Do you express your gender in exactly the same way? Pretty quickly, you can come up with an example of someone that you share a gender identity, but you don't necessarily have the same exact experience. So when we say treat trans people just the same as other people, that doesn't mean to turn off your brain and not think about what that person needs to feel in community. It doesn't necessarily mean treating everyone exactly the same, because we know that not everybody needs the same thing to feel seen and affirmed. But it does take mental attention and intention, for instance, to use someone's correct pronouns, particularly if you're sort of navigating, you've been socialized into more normative gender expression, and then you're encountering folks that are sort of breaking out of the mental model that you were socialized into. But the point that we want to make about that is that this is not fundamentally different from the other ways that we put energy into coming to know, see, and care about other people in our communities and our congregations. So gender is like so funky, but it does weird things to people's brains. We often encounter folks that really do want to be affirming, and for some reason, the like gender difference, the like learning how to see this person, learning about this person in the gender category, it gets kind of slotted into this other domain than other individual differences of like, I like running and rock climbing, and Charlie has a crochet obsession, and these kinds of things that you may come to know about us. And so the thing is like, if you understand the work that it takes, because it does take work, right? The work that it takes to know, hey, how's this person want to be seen gender-wise? What pronouns do they want to have used for them? What language is going to feel affirming for them? If you can start to see that as like, hey, that's just one of many individual differences, I think you will start to feel more capable and more powerful in being able to be affirming towards trans people, because you have an amazing brain. You have an amazing human brain, and you navigate these individual differences all the time. So when we categorize trans experience or gender differences as fundamentally different, these aspects of interaction that are connected to transness, so pronouns and other gendered terms, they get shuffled off into this category that just seems to cause a lot of panic. But with any type of difference, each of us might be more or less familiar. So sometimes we have these adjustments we have to make. It may take more mental effort. But this effort around gender, seeing trans folks, seeing any person of any gender, if we start to treat that as it's one of many differences that each individual has, and we're coming to know each person as an individual, it truly does become easier. Which leads us into our fourth point.
All right, this is the last of them, so bear with us. It's also, I think, the longest one. So this is not a test. Stop assuming that the reaction trans people are going to have to you when, not if, when you mess up. Stop assuming that that is going to be evaluative and punitive. Some common assumptions that we encounter all the time are that interactions with trans folks and other minorities too, this dynamic is not unique to trans folks, but those interactions are somehow a test that one passes or fails. And if you have ever taken a test in which you felt not super competent and nervous, you will know nerves do not help you perform better when you are taking a test. So working to say, this is not a test. Working to learn a new skill takes effort And yes, you will succeed, and there will be times when you are still struggling and working on it, but it's not inherently a test. And it does involve remembering new information. But as Nick pointed out, that new information isn't fundamentally a different type of information than what you're already encountering, what your brain can take in. Learning does take effort, but your brain is able to learn things. I promise you that your brain can learn things. And when you're not fearful, not so fearful anyway, it's easier to learn things. If you have ever learned a new skill, whether that was fly fishing or art or pickleball, I know all of you out there who are pickleball people, you did not play pickleball 10 years ago because pickleball was not a thing 10 years ago, and you've learned how to play pickleball. You can learn new things. But if you're treating every time you go to play pickleball or every time you go fly fishing and you're trying to learn how to go fly fishing, if every time you do that it is a high stakes test, you are in this anxious mental posture in which you cannot effectively learn and you can't effectively practice. When we're anxious, we tend to avoid the thing that makes us anxious. And that gets in the way, right? If you're avoiding it, you can't practice it. And what it requires is practice. You can't get more comfortable with it if you don't practice it and feel that familiarity developing. Anxiety and avoidance also contribute to that felt sense of distance that we've talked about earlier, that trans folks can experience in interactions with cis folks, well-meaning cis folks even. Even in an inclusive congregation, being trans can feel lonely at times, because if people are so focused on doing it right or passing the test, they can be more socially formal or distant. And it's also hard to build friendship when you're in an anxious posture, and it can be hard to build friendship with people who are in that anxious space about interacting. Another common assumption is that the reaction from the trans person when you mess up, whether that's pronouns, new name, whatever it might be, that the reaction is going to be punitive. So there's sort of an unfortunate trope about angry trans people, and that there will be a harsh response. And we really want to point out that this assumption, this worry, inverts the power structure in the dynamic. It implies that the trans person is the person who has more power in the situation, and that the cis person is the one experiencing a high stakes interaction. And that's just fundamentally not the case because of what we know about the hierarchy and valuing of cis and trans experiences in society. The consequences of messing up can be real, right? Someone can respond and correct you, and you might that can be forceful at times or can be assertive at times. But as a reminder, like the cis person have more power in the world in regard to that type of interaction. And I say that not to shame you or make you feel stressed about it, but just to remind you that it's not as high stakes for you as it might feel in the moment. And then finally, there's a very common assumption that when you make a mistake and you then move to explain and over-explain how or why you made that mistake, how or why you continue to struggle with a name, with pronouns, why it's hard for you. There's an assumption, I think, that people are making, that doing that is helping to preserve or repair the relationship, that you want the trans person that you're interacting with to know that you're not a bad person, that you're not doing it on purpose, that you don't mean to harm them. But it actually gets in the way of doing the real repair. When you have something like that, when you mess up in that kind of way, whether it's name, whether it's pronouns, whether it's other kind of gender terminology, whoops, I meant, and then correcting yourself and continuing, that acknowledges the mistake, it corrects it. Over explanation is not required. Doing the action of correcting yourself, of noticing and correcting yourself, of hearing when other people try to correct you and taking that on board, that is more effective repair, actually, than going into this extended dialogue about why it's hard, how you just can't figure it out, and this sort of like long explanation about how you came to be in this place.
And it also gives you, whoops, I meant, is then in fact a moment of practice. I think both of us have often experienced folks really wanting to, with good intentions, trying to preserve or repair with this kind of over explanation. But then it's like they don't even practice saying the thing the way that would be the affirming way. And so it's like a missed opportunity to get those pathways in your brain going of what the sort of affirming statement would be in that moment. So all of these things together, we've now put them here on a list on one slide. Did you notice that the word trans is not in any of these highlighted points? So of course, we've emphasized what each of these things looks like in relation to trans inclusion. That's our area of expertise, as it were. But these are all actions and postures that support inclusive community more generally. And, you know, for trans folks, for folks of other marginalized identities, and I think also just for any of us and all of us who want to be a part of a community. And so just to close things up, we want to emphasize that our liberation is tied up together. If we live in a world in which trans people are liberated and free, it means that everyone else is also liberated and free to be their truest gendered self. And this extends beyond gender. As many folks have pointed out before us, none of us are truly free until all of us are free. And so looking to how do we liberate and make free those who are the most marginalized, that is doing the work for everyone else as well. And to circle back to this question of Jesus' ministry, that from our perspective, to be Christ-like is not to be driven by pity, but it's about recognizing that our well-being is bound up together. And that together, trans and cis and everything in between, we act alongside each other toward dissolving hierarchies. And like humans love a hierarchy. We keep doing it. We keep getting into these situations where we think that a hierarchy is going to help, and yet hierarchy keeps harming us. And that hierarchy will never save us. It is the othering that hierarchy does that creates such a difference in outcomes for trans and cis people in our current world. And really the reason why we're talking so much about you seeing your place in this struggle, you seeing these similarities across cis and trans experience, is to help build powerful allyship that's working toward dissolving those hierarchies, and dissolving these hierarchies that are often still implicit even in the well-intentioned efforts at inclusion. So it's easy to see some of those hierarchies in the more hateful rhetoric towards trans people, but it's important to acknowledge that some of these othering, these hierarchies exist in the well-intentioned efforts at inclusion as well. And so really working to see, hey, this is not cis people helping trans people. This is cis and trans people working together towards gender liberation for everybody.
And just to kind of close us out, to say, we've been thinking a lot about Jesus's anti-imperial messages lately, both on our own, just me and Neek, and in our congregation. The Love First crowd can attest. Ultimately, we think it boils down to this: you cannot stay aligned with Rome and follow Jesus at the same time. Within the domain of trans allyship, this means that you cannot stay aligned with gender normativity and truly work alongside trans people for gender liberation. This doesn't mean it's wrong to be straight or cisgender or otherwise not a queer bone in your body. But it does mean disinvesting from the normative expectations of gender expression and identity in order to free not only your trans siblings, but yourself and other members of your community.
So with that, we'll field any questions people have.
I'm going to take a look in the chat here. Okay, it says too new. Okay, am I going to get this done right here?
I don't currently see any questions, pending questions in the chat. But we will take them. And also, of course, questions on all the topics we focused on are, of course, welcome, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. Like if you
if you do have but I just have a terminology question, we can field that too. Don't hold back.
Picky. You can ask any question.
I'm just going to make a comment. This is Jennifer. I think that this is not a test was particularly powerful for me. As a mathematician, I've given a lot of tests in my life, and I've taken a lot of tests. So I know that test anxiety stuff. So it was really, it was nice to hear. Now, I don't know if you would characterize it this way, sort of forgiveness in advance. Is that a fair characterization?
I would almost say that when we say this is not a test, I think what we mean is that it would be helpful if we focus less on forgiveness, in the sense of.
Oh, and it's a me wanting your forgiveness.
Yeah. Someone texted me just the other day and they were like, "Dang, girl." And I was like, no, girl, please. But the dang does feel right about, I'm very conflict averse. So I'm always very jokey in my hey, please don't misgender me. And the person was genuinely apologetic and also was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Forgive me?" ? And I do think that, I don't know, I guess to me, it's a weird question to ask because for my own personal stance, this person didn't need forgiveness because I was not holding some kind of grudge or it is a moment of harm, but I think sometimes I experience it as that there can be too much of an emphasis on forgiveness. So I don't know. I think if it helps you, then yes, sure, we forgive you in advance. But I think
about forgiving myself.
I think that's a much better way to think of it in terms of this. This is not a test. Is again, that anxious posture is not super helpful, and the fact that people are really often concerned with forgiveness is part of, I think, that anxious posture. And so I would encourage you to forgive yourself. I think we give grace to folks all the time because we get misgendered all the time. And if you can give grace to yourself, that is part of saying, hey, this isn't a test. We were talking about it the other day, with fly fishing. You're not going to do good if someone's yelling at you every time you're trying to cast your fly fishing. And of course, there's the trope of the angry trans person yelling at you while you're trying to fly fish. But also, a lot of us have
yelling at yourself.
Critical. What was that, Charlie?
I said, if you're internally yelling at yourself.
Yeah,
the whole
exactly. A
time.
lot of us have this kind of like quite critical internal voice. And so sometimes, we're navigating this trope of the angry trans person. And yes, sometimes there are people who are really forceful and really angry. Like most of us are not. Most of us are like, oh my God, please, like, could you please not misgender me? And I think often it's like the harsher voice for people is their internal voice that's being quite hard on yourself and maybe not being super forgiving on yourself. And like the hard part for us is when that can kind of leach into like people's fear about us being angry. And it's like most of us are pretty chill. Like sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're low resource, sometimes
it's the 107th time we've been misgendered that day, and it's not about you.
Right. But I do think it's like good to think like you do have to give yourself forgiveness, because if you're just beating yourself up, that's reproducing the notion of like, hey, this is a test and I'm failing. So yeah, thanks for your comment.
I'll just add though that like when we say like, yes, like forgive yourself and like in advance forgiveness from us, the reason we say that and like the compact we are hoping to enter into is that means that you will then be able to practice and work on it and get better. It's not meant as permission to not try. It's meant to say, we know you're trying. We know it's challenging. Keep going. Not just don't, it's fine if you don't try. That's not what we're saying.
And I think that people kind of get hung up because they're like expecting that we expect perfection, especially like family members. For whatever reason, they seem to think that you're like, oh, well, you're expecting us to be perfect. And like, I don't think any of us are, but I will say that the biggest thing that can make a difference in terms of like misgendering always sucks, but the thing that can make a difference in how I experience misgendering is that if I see someone making progress over 6 months, over a year in our relationship, like it makes more space in my heart, in my being to really like feel grace and compassion and to like it just really changes the experience. I have people in my life who, like, let's be real, we're not good at the pronoun thing. And also like some of them learn slower than others, but like I have someone who really sucked at this 5 years ago. And now generally most of the time they're pretty good. Are they perfect? No, but it makes a difference to me that I have seen that change over time. I also have people in my life who are arguably not that much better at pronouns than they were 5 years ago. And that's hard. So I do think it's like, no one's expecting perfection, but I would say that like, we do want people to practice and that feels more like repair than very effusive apologies without the practice.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I saw Linda. Did you have a comment or question?
I have a comment. I'm Linda McCullough, pastor at Eden Prairie, and I go by the pronouns of she and her. And so I really appreciated what you shared about, somebody in a meeting or something saying pronouns, so it opens the door for it to become more natural. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Linda. I see a fun comment in the chat that I would love to respond to.
I'm going to look at the chat.
So Caitlin says, please feel free not to answer if this is too personal, but I feel that for me and some other cis individuals, I think it would be beneficial to hear some examples of the experience that leads you to know that you are trans, or what some core trans experiences are. So we're going to talk about this, but in a way, it's not roundabout, but anyway, this brings up something I think that is really important. So earlier we said, hey, sometimes people think that only trans people have gender and that cisgender people don't really have gender, by which we mean the sort of like experience and performance of gender is really visible for trans people because we are finding an incongruence with what is kind of expected of us with the gender we were assigned at birth. And then we make choices to feel more comfortable, to feel more at home. And so to us and to many people around us, it feels like we have gender, obviously. Look at us. We've made these choices, we've made these changes. And we can talk a little bit about kind of what kind of led us to experience ourselves or understand ourselves as trans. But the reason why I really like this comment is that one of the things that we talk about this a lot, that was like, would be so beneficial for cisgender people is to spend time exploring gender in kind of the same manner that trans people explore gender. And so if you were assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, and your comfortable gender expression is generally mostly aligned with kind of the expectations for your assigned gender, you probably just like have not thought that much about gender. You probably haven't thought that much about what makes something a gendered expression, but particularly like, you know, what feels good to you, or you've just kind of like, this is what you were socialized into. And so like, if we could change the world, we would have gender exploration workshops for all of the people, because it's so often people are like, oh, well, it's just trans people who explore gender. And, you know, one of the things that I think like a common assumption or misunderstanding is that like, oh, if you start, the only people who explore gender are trans people. And if you start exploring gender, you will find out that you are trans, and that those are related, right? Because if it's the only people who are trans who explore gender, then if you explore gender, you will find out you are trans. But the thing is like, there are people who explore gender and they are like, hey, am I trans? And then they kind of like play with their expression and think about it and reflect on all these things. And they're like, oh yeah, no, I'm not trans, I'm just cis. And so I do think like everybody here, I would love for you to spend time exploring gender and thinking about, hey, how do I want to present myself to the world? But I guess we can say, Charlie, do you want to dive into like, how do you know? How?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. I think obviously Nick and I
Sorry.
will both be, you know, we'll share some things and not other things maybe, but about our personal experiences. But I think one of the things that for me, like first cued me into, there's maybe something going on here, was a persistent discomfort that I couldn't quite name or put my finger on. I didn't quite know what it was. It was not a clear cut like feeling, but this just sense of this, something gives me a weird feeling when people would describe me as a girl or as a woman. So I was assigned female at birth. And so in my childhood and in my early adulthood, anytime that someone would describe me that way, I would just be like, I don't know about that. Like that feels off. And it was not as clear as being able to say like, I'm not that, I am this instead. It was just sort of like that word, like to use some internet lingo, it gives me the ick. But I couldn't figure out what it was. And just this sort of persistent sense that everyone around me had understood something about how, like all of my peers, all of my girl peers seemed to understand how to like be a girl. And I was working really hard to do that, but couldn't quite ever feel natural at it. And it took me a really long time to then figure out from those early feelings of something's off here, I don't know what it is though, to then get to a place where I could both have the knowledge of trans people existing and then do the personal work to kind of come to that awareness as an identity. But
And I think, you know, we're just two trans people. We do have some shared experiences, but the reality is that some people know from a really young age, they're like,
Yep.
hey, whoa, I'm definitely not a boy, or I'm definitely not a girl. My working theory is that that's more common for binary identified trans people, because if your internal sense of gender is, say that you're a girl, but you were assigned male at birth, but you see the gender identity of girls and women, it is easier for you to be like, oh, wait, that thing that I feel, that is that thing. Again, is this backed by data? Only anecdotal, but that's my working theory. And it is like, I think, you know, for both of us being non-binary, that like, it's it's funny that you mentioned, Charlie, the like, oh, this just doesn't feel quite right.
Mhm.
Early in grad school, I was not yet sort of expressing a non-binary identity or transmasculine identity. And this like call for a scholarship was shared that was for like women in X, Y, and Z fields. And like by all appearances, even my own self-understanding at that time, it would be something that I would be qualified for. I should apply for this thing. And I distinctly remember like I was like, oh, I shouldn't apply. That should be for the people for whom this is meant for. Like that, and like it's weird stuff like that. You know,
Yeah.
I'll have that kind of thought, and then it'll be like, it was like years later before I was like, oh wait, this is what this means for me. And I think that a lot of folks have that kind of little experiences like that sprinkled through time that you maybe don't even super notice in that moment. And then it's like, once you've maybe been like a critical mass of these things or something, you know, for me, it was like I had the mental health care support that I was then able to really explore this in a more meaningful way. That then looking back, you're like, oh man, oh buddy, there was a lot of moments.
How did I miss it
it's
for
like you
so
don't
long?
always, it doesn't necessarily in the moment, right? Or I don't know, I think like people like for transmasculine people who experience chest dysphoria, weird number of transmasc people have kind of in their adolescence or young adulthood thought, well, wouldn't it just be convenient if I got breast cancer? So I had a double mastectomy. And like, if you don't know that transgender affirming care is an option, then like, but your brain is experiencing dysphoria, then like that's where you it's a weirdly common thing that
It's a brain trying to find a solution with what it
right.
knows exists for options
Right.
when it doesn't know that the real solution is an option. So it's
Yeah.
not like actively a wish for the experience of cancer. It is a wish for a removal of a body part
Yeah.
that's causing dysphoria. But
And I think I do worry that sometimes it can get quite like simplified or essentialized. So sometimes people will be like, oh, well, I must be trans. And like, that's not the way I mean to word it. Sometimes people will equate gender expression with gender identity. And so, for instance, you might have a kid assigned male at birth who's like super into painting nails and wearing dresses. And as a parent, you might say, oh my gosh, I think my child is trans. And like, maybe that kid might be trans. They might be a trans girl or might be non-binary. Also, like, I think if we're speaking about gender liberation, we also have to include in that frame, this could just be a cis boy who like likes painting nails and wearing dresses. And so I think like for me, if I reflect on my own experience, it's these moments of like, oh yeah, that's a women's scholarship. That's not for me. Or wouldn't it be convenient if I had cancer, so I had a double mastectomy because for some reason that feels right. Like those are the things that I identify as my kind of like, oh yeah, there's something there. Not how I dressed as a child. Like I wore my brother's hand-me-downs. I didn't want to wear my sister's hand-me-downs. I was a very like masculine presenting child, but that didn't mean for me, that didn't mean like, oh, I thought I was a boy or I knew that I wasn't a girl. I was just like, I just like wearing, it was the 90s. So like, I just like wearing like cargo pants and camo shirts, you know, like that actually, for me, that didn't mean anything about my gender. Like I could have, if it turns out, if it was that I was a girl, like that would have been my comfortable expression in my childhood. And it was my comfortable expression. And the fact that I was allowed that probably helped the fact that I didn't realize I was trans until many, many years later. But I think it's important that we don't get stuck into thinking, well, it's just if you have non-normative gender expression, that's a sign that you're trans. I think that for some people that might be how their experience is. But it really can be more diverse than that. And I think like gender liberation for everybody, like we don't want to be forcing girls who love wearing super masculine clothes. We don't want to be saying, hey, you must be a trans boy, and vice versa. Like if there are boys who want to wear dresses, like we would love for them to have that space to explore gender identity, but we don't want to force them to be anything. Then like anybody can be anything. That's all I have to say. Next question in the chat. How do you keep a positive worldview when you live in our society today?
I'll
Do you want
let
me
you
to
know
go
when
or
I
do you want
find
me to?
out. No, I'm kidding.
What'd you say?
I said I'll let you know when I figure it out. But
We are doing our best over here, you know? Um,
I mean, I'll say to be real, it's hard.
it's really
And
hard these
there are a lot
days.
of days when I don't have a positive point of view. So I don't want to sit here and be the presenter who's like, um, it's hard, but we're going to be okay and it's fine and I get through it. Like, I don't, that's not the reality of what it's like to be, I think,
Yeah,
not just to be a trans person, but to be a lot of different people in
to
our
be a
world
lot of
right
people in the
now.
world today.
So part of the answer is some days I don't, some days I'm really sad. Some days
Yeah,
I'm really
we do
scared.
cry a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, crying. Highly recommend it. It does wonders. It does wonders. It's very important to do. But I would also say, I really try to connect with, like, if we're just kind of thinking in the domain of transness, I try to connect with fellow trans people. I think, it's not like not every trans person sees me and I don't see every trans person amazingly well, but in general, like, you can really, like, if you really want to be seen and have your transness be seen, we seek out community with trans folks. um, I I work at a summer camp for trans kids every summer, and I literally, some days, on those days where you can't find the positive view, I'm literally just like, oh my god, but this summer we are going to camp, and really to see, it's this magical space where almost everybody is trans, and the beautiful thing about that is that then your transness, your gender, becomes like the least relevant, least important thing about you. Like, of course people explore their expression in that space, but like, it's beautiful because it isn't about, I'm fighting to have these cis people see me. So I try to hang out with trans people, admittedly. Lately I feel like we've been, plugging into, some good music, and, trying to connect with community. I'm not in Minnesota right now, but Charlie goes to choir, and when I'm in Minnesota, I go to choir. That, I
I'm
mean,
only
singing
in
with
choir for the
people,
community. The other choir people on the call will know this.
big recommend. Singing with people is like top notch. Um, yes, and oh, and also I think, trying to, I think for me, maybe for us, trying to figure out those ways that you can make a difference. And that's tricky, right? Because, like, some people have a lot of what's the word? Income to spend. Wow, brain. Anyway, income that you can spend on things that are not your
Disposable income.
disposable. Thank you, Charlie. Disposable income. Like, for some people, that can look like donating to the legal efforts to protect trans rights. But, sometimes we can get into the space of like, hey, how can we make a difference when we don't have a ton of disposable income? But really trying to connect with other networks and thinking about what are the ways that we can take action, not just to support our trans peers, but to support other people who are being negatively impacted in our current world.
And, I to not be totally the doom and gloom one between the two of us, the work that I do, the professional work that I do, is really important to me. And it also means that I like encounter a lot of people in a lot of different kind of places and thinking about these issues. And the fact that you all, like, this many people said they wanted to come and listen to us talk about gender liberation. So the moments when I encounter people who are trying to learn, as much as there can be parts of that are challenging at times and parts that are, like, tiring and all of the things, like, I keep having to say, like, there are people still who care, and this isn't, just on this isn't a gender thing, but, like, as in the last months, as we've been experiencing such just horror in Minnesota, the one thing that kind of like helped me a little bit was seeing how many people were responding and trying to do something, anything. And it, you know, there were days when that wasn't necessarily fully a hopeful feeling, but it was at least some space between despair and hope. I was somewhere in between those at times, but at least I wasn't fully in the despair. And so sometimes when I'm in those hard days, to just be like, there are people who are trying to do something, anything, and that can be helpful, and can be like a thing to hang on to in the hard days.
Yeah. And I think inspiring and motivating to also see what I can do as an individual.
Yeah, exactly.
There is a great question in the chat. It's a hard one. If people I love, such as kids, want to explore gender identity, and I want them to be able to explore however they want, wear what they want, paint nails, etc., what can we say to others, such as grandparents, who are against that kind of gender exploration? So I will say that we don't have kids currently.
Yeah.
So some of the folks that we know who do have like trans kids, for instance, are navigating some of these things. And again, this whole theme of like trans and cis experiences, it's like they might be resources for gender exploration for kids that are probably not even trans, but just to explore that gender expression. So I would say, like, in this particular domain, we're not necessarily experts about navigating the sort of relational role of like parent, child, parent, grandparent. But I do think it can be helpful to remind people that gender exploration isn't dangerous. Now, of course, whether people believe you when you say that I suppose that's another thing. But I do think as that thing of like, I think people are kind of like scared of gender exploration because they're like, oh, if you let your boy wear a dress, then he's gonna turn into a trans kid. And like, maybe like approximately 1% to 2% chance, maybe. And also like most likely not, which ultimately, like, do we want to be going around making the argument of like, don't worry, statistically, your kid probably won't be trans? Like, that's not really the argument I'm endorsing. But I do think like when we're talking about like folks who have a lot of fear around gender exploration, who are very invested in kind of enforcing normative gender expression, I do think that it can be worth being like, hey, like, it's not dangerous for this person to do this, and also like just exploring different ways of expressing themselves is not going to like make a kid trans. And like there's nothing wrong with being trans, but when we're dealing with folks who are kind of just scared of gender exploration in general, like painting your nails doesn't actually change your gender. Like if it were that easy, like trans people would be having such an easy time with gender affirming care. I wish it were that easy.
If only.
If only. Charlie, do you have something to add? I want to do a better job of responding to this, but I need a moment to think.
I don't know that I have thoughts I can get out in the approximately 2.5 minutes we have left. So I just to acknowledge it is a hard thing. And I guess like there's always room to act is how I approach everything these days. So, you know, there has to be a way to let your kid explore at least a little bit. Even if there are complicated, hard relationships in your life that make that tricky, there has to be a way. And I don't know your life, so I don't know the specifics of what that's going to look like, but keep with it. There has to be a way to try at least a little bit.
That was the breathing room I needed for my brain to do its work, which is what I really want to say about this is that like we can't control what other people frankly say, do, etc. Like we can't control if a grandparent is disapproving of this. But I feel like best case scenario is that your child can know that you are not experiencing shame about their gender exploration and that you are supportive of that exploration. And
Yeah.
that supportiveness might mean, oh, that you go shopping and you demonstrate that you are open to looking at all the clothing in the store that would fit this person. Not just, a boys section or a girls section. They can look like those kinds of actions. And it can also look like telling someone, hey, I'm proud of who you are. I'm proud of who you're becoming. I'm excited to experiment. Like maybe it looks like you're all going to paint your nails and that you are modeling exploration. And you as an adult, maybe you have a pretty clear sense of how you want to express yourself gender wise. But it can still be a valuable experience to share that, like, oh, you want to explore painting your nails? Cool. Let's do it together. And I think it's tricky because, of course, many of us want to try to avoid conflict. And so I have seen that sometimes this ends up looking like, oh, I allow my child to explore within the house, but then when we visit the grandparents, that I lay down the law of, no, you're not allowed to wear painted nails to grandparents' house. And again, we don't know your life. We don't really know the full context of every individual situation. But I do think that best case scenario is that you don't become an extension of the shame or the gender normativity coming from other people in your life. In your life. I can do plurals, singulars. Anyway, because I think that people are going to have opinions about non-normative gender expression. And if you are the buffer between those things and your kid, and you are supportive and enthusiastic and exploring these things with them, that is really, really meaningful to even have one individual who is supportive of that exploration, and
It's
to not
literally
become an
life-saving
extension.
for trans people, like one adult who
Yeah,
accepts
like the
them.
statistics-
it's quite literally statistically life-saving for trans people. So, and it doesn't have to mean you don't have to fix
Yeah.
everything, but yeah.
I think I just think it's I've been exploring this with not being an extension of some shame coming from relatives in my life. I've been exploring that for myself, of not becoming the extension of that for myself. And I think that there is a parallel there in not becoming an extension of that by saying hey, we're going over here, so you can't wear this dress or you can't do this particular thing. It might look like, hey, let's come up with a plan of if you're going to wear this thing to this space, do you want to say something if your grandparent says X, Y, and Z? Do you want me to say something if your grandparent says X, Y, or Z? To have those conversations instead of saying, hey, no, you can't do this. Because then they're experiencing you as the same extension of that gender normativity. Sorry, that was long-winded. We're 2 minutes past, but I just needed to say it.
Thank you both. This has been a really powerful experience to hear you speak so authentically. I'm going to ask Carol Otteson to say a little bit about the spring learning event. Carol, are you?
I'm right here. Yeah.
Okay.
Was there going to be a slide up with this or not? If not, that's fine. I just can't remember. Oh, Deb's putting it up.
Deb's going to put up the slide.
Okay, perfect. I just want to invite everybody for our spring gathering. We have it scheduled for Saturday, April 18th from 11:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. This is at Holy Trinity United Methodist Church in Prior Lake. We are going to be doing gathering, reconnecting, having a potluck lunch, pretty much the things we've always done. There will be a panel discussion, and the topic of the panel discussion is your church ready for an LGBT plus clergy person? It's more than being a reconciling congregation. We may be workshopping that title. We just kind of came up with that for this slide right now. But anyhow, we are going to have a panel of clergy who are in the LGBT community, who will be clergy and others and lay people who are going to be talking in a panel discussion. Again, it's going to start with a gathering time, then a potluck, and then we will have a presentation, which will be live streamed, by the way, if you can't make it. We'll be getting the invitations out relatively soon. I just want you to get your calendars marked now for Saturday, April 18th.
Thank you, Carol. And one more time, a round of applause if you can unmute yourself and
Most of us not good.
for
Wonderful.
Charlie and
Thank you
me.
all. We're so glad that you came. Like really, really lovely to know that there are people wanting to think about this and
Really lovely.
move in the world.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care. Stay warm. Stay safe.